I'm just gonna get right to it and say the yeast is the single most important thing that you can focus on to make better beer. And today, I'm gonna give you 4 tips to help you keep your yeast nice and happy and healthy and ultimately make better beer. Look at that yeast cake down there. I mean, I always knew yeast was really important, but it wasn't until I did this split batch experiment with a cider a while back that I realized just how important picking the right yeast was in making great beer. You see, those 3 ciders came out very different, and the only change was the yeast. You see, as brewers, we focus on making the best wort possible. And don't get me wrong, sanitation, recipe, your process, all those things are very important. But at the end of the day, if we don't take care of our yeast or we pick the wrong yeast, we could totally mess up or completely change the final product. For example, I'm making a hazy IPA today. I want it to be juicy and hazy, and so I picked Juice by Imperial Yeast. But if I were to take a Saison yeast and put that in the same wort, I'm gonna get an entirely different beer at the end of it, and it might not be what I want. Tip number 2, take care of your yeast. And honestly, every other tip in this video could probably go back to this one thing. Just take care of your yeast. Yeast is alive and you want to make sure it stays that way. From the moment you get it at your house, make sure that you take care of it. Store it in a cool, dark place. I like to keep mine in the refrigerator. And I love liquid yeast. That's what I'm planning on using today. But I can't always get liquid yeast here, especially in the summertime, just because I have to get it shipped to me and I don't trust that yeast sitting on the back of a truck in 110-degree temperatures. So luckily for me, there's a lot of different options out there, and I've really been having a lot of fun experimenting with some dry yeast options, especially Nova Lager for my lagers. And with liquid yeast, you want to make sure you use it within 4 months of the use by date for most yeast companies. Let's just say you don't use your liquid yeast. That would bring me to tip number 3, and that is to make a starter. You're not always going to need this step. But if you're brewing a lager, maybe something that's high alcohol, or you've got a liquid yeast that's maybe past its prime and you want to make sure that it's still good, go ahead and make a starter. If you've never made a starter, I will link to a video in the description that walks you through my process on how to make a starter. Tip number 4. Now that you've made your wort, you've pitched your yeast, it's time to keep your beer at the right temperature. You need to keep that yeast at a consistent temperature. So let's just say I'm brewing an ale and the yeast that I'm using says I should ferment between 64 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm gonna pick a temperature, let's just say I pick 66, and I need to keep it at that temperature consistently, meaning there's no wild fluctuations. It's not going down to 63 at night and it's not getting up to 72 or 74 during the day, especially in the beginning of fermentation. Keeping a consistent temperature is super important. Once your beer is done fermenting, you can cool it down and then package it up using your preferred method. My preferred method is to keg my beers, and as you can see, I am not using the Anvil bucket for this. There were 2 rounds of dry hops, so I wanted to get it off of the dry hop. I wanted to get it off of the first round of dry hops and then keep it oxygen free since there was going to be a lot of hops in this. So I did end up transferring it oxygen free into my all-rounder, and then from my all-rounder I'm now transferring into a keg oxygen free. And what's going to be left down here at the bottom is some leftover yeast. Now you can totally reuse that yeast, and I normally would, but because this beer had a couple rounds of dry hops on it, there's going to be a lot of hop matter in that yeast, and I really don't want to reuse it. But if that yeast cake was clean from, like, say a light lager or something like that, you could totally reuse it like I did in this video right here. If you want to find out how this beer turned out, why don't you go ahead and click right up here and I'll take you over to the tasting. In the meantime, cheers. See you in the next one.